Good evening, and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Joy Lanzendorfer. My name is Jamie Madsen, and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and I'll also be your host for the evening. I'd like to take a moment here to thank you all for your event proceeds. It allows us to continue hosting this free event, so anytime you can support or buy a book from an event, we really appreciate you. We appreciate you anyway, but it's always nice to be able to provide it. And just a couple items to note before we get started tonight. I'll be using the chat box to provide links to view upcoming Copperfields events, details for purchasing tonight's title, as well as the discount code, and also my contact details. Additionally, the Q&A box will be your go-to tonight with any questions or comments for Joy. The format will feature between 30 to 35 minutes of speaking and will then be followed by a live Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A that says, you'll see an icon that says Q&A. Please submit your questions and comments here. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce tonight's local author, Joy Lanzendorfer. Joy is an author and journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, NPR, Poetry Foundation, as well as many others. Her writing was included in the Best Small Fictions Anthology and was notable in the Best American Essays 2019 and 2020. She has been awarded grants and residencies from the Discovered Awards for Emerging Literary Artists, Wild Acres Residency Program, and the Speculative Literature Foundation. In addition, she's the host of the book-oriented radio show and podcast, What's the Story, on 95.9 FM The Crush, which is also sponsored by the Sonoma County Library. Joy is with us tonight to discuss her brand new book, Right Back Where We Started From. We've been talking a lot before. I'm really excited to hand this over to you. So why don't you take it away for us, Joy?
All right. Well, thank you. So it's such an honor to have my book launch at Copperfields, which is one of my favorite bookstores. I go to the Petaluma Copperfields all the time, at least once a week. So I'm thrilled to be here tonight. Thank you for having me. I hope if you do buy the book, you will consider buying it from Copperfields. So tonight, as mentioned, I want to talk about my debut novel, which is called Right Back Where We Started From. It's literary historical fiction, a multi-generational saga that tells the story of three women over the course of 100 years of California history. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the novel. And introduce you to the three main characters in the book. They are Sandra Sanborn, her mother Mabel, and her grandmother Vira. So then I'm going to talk a little about my inspiration for the novel, which is partially based on my family history. And I'm going to tell you the publishing story, which is a little unusual. I finished this book back in 2012. So I'm going to tell you why it's just now coming out in 2021. And then I'll finish up with a short reading and try to answer whatever questions you have. Right Back Where We Started From begins in 1930s Hollywood. Although it doesn't stay in that time period, it moves around quite a bit. Sandra Sanborn has just left her husband in Santa Rosa. She's originally from Healdsburg and has driven down to LA during the Great Depression to become a movie star. And she's convinced that she's destined for greatness and that somehow in her life, she will become rich and successful. And she believes this because her mother, Mabel, has always told her that their family was special. They once used to be very prominent and important, according to Mabel. And if bad fortune hadn't gotten in the way, Sandra would have grown up wealthy and important herself. So Sandra is determined to return her family name to a place of prominence through her own success. But as she's in Hollywood trying to get discovered, a family secret in the form of a letter arrives that suggests that the way Sandra sees her family and therefore herself may not be accurate. So, however, Sandra isn't a very introspective person, and she definitely doesn't want to look at the truth. So, as she's running away from these secrets by trying to become a movie star and social climbing in San Francisco, the book begins to tell you the real story of her family, starting with her grandmother, Vira, coming over in a covered wagon during the California Gold Rush and ending in World War II era San Francisco. So this is a novel that is very much about greed and ambition in America. Um, and and I have to say, like, say what you will about the book, it is an exciting read. There's a lot going on here. There's betrayal and lies and manipulation. Uh, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake makes an appearance. There's a riot at a boxing match. There's a palatial Victorian mansion that's loosely based on the ever expanding Winchester Mystery House in San Jose. Um, I based a character on Britney Spears back when she was shaving her head and hitting paparazzi with umbrellas. And I drew inspiration from the actor Mary Astor and the scandal surrounding her Purple Diary, which was a Hollywood sex scandal back in the 1930s. So this is got a lot going on in this book, and it's a little different from other historical novels in that while I'm using history as backdrop for the story, it's very much a work of the imagination. I braided fact and fiction together and exaggerated details to make a hyper realized, almost mythical version of California. In some cases, the scenes are bordering on magical realism, as you'll see from the short chapter I'm going to read in a few minutes. And a lot of the humor in this book is winking at you from this place of slightly off kilter reality, which goes along with the novel's themes of lies versus truth and myths versus reality. Uh, excuse me. That said, you know, I did do a lot of research for this book. In general, in both my fiction and my nonfiction, I write a lot about history and the past. And as part of this novel is set in Healdsburg, I spent a lot of time at the Healdsburg Library looking through old microfilm of newspapers to get details about prune farming. They used to call Healdsburg the buckle of the prune belt. I don't know if you know that. I spent a lot of time at Sonoma State University's library reading books about the lives of women in California and what it was like on the home front of World War II and that kind of thing. And even though I was writing about some familiar eras of California history, like the golden age of Hollywood or the gold rush, I tried to come at them from angles that were fresh and unfamiliar. So, for example, in the Hollywood section, I researched the central casting system, which was how Hollywood used to get players for bit parts in movies. It was a gig economy, sort of like Uber or something, that went through this central office, thus central casting. And it became exploitative when droves of people started coming to Hollywood to break into movies. The amount of people trying to get parts drove the pay way down and forced actors to live on a subsistence level. And that is a huge part of Sandra's Hollywood experience. And for the Gold Rush section, just to give you another example, I researched a lot about the early San Francisco stock exchange and the chaos that happened when people began trading mining stocks. I was also fascinated by these little towns that would develop suddenly and violently when gold was discovered and then be abandoned once that vein was tapped. Of course, many of those gold rush towns still exist. I set a section of the book in Hangtown, which today is called Placerville. And I love that name change. I feel like it says a lot about how California deals with the uglier part of its past. Hangtown versus Placerville. But the funny thing is, when I started working on this book, I didn't sit down to write an exciting saga, and I wasn't trying to make a faithful rendering of life in the past. I was thinking about my grandparents. So both of my grandparents on my dad's side were very colorful people. Um, my grandmother was born in Healdsburg, and she grew up working in prune orchards, harvesting prunes, and as sort of a migrant picker situation. And then she ended up going to Santa Rosa Junior College back in the 20s when women didn't really go to college very much. And she was a musician and she was a piano teacher. She married 3 times, and she had this epic, turbulent romance with my grandfather, which is kind of the heart of the book. Um, Sandra, who is loosely based on my grandmother, meets a man named Frederick, who is loosely based on my grandfather. And I hesitate to even say that because the real people were nothing like these characters, but I used aspects of their lives to make these fictional people, if that makes sense. And Frederick is this German immigrant who's a photographer and a bit of a liar, just like Sandra. And she kind of thinks she's too good for him, but she's also attracted to him. And that's the dynamic that starts out their relationship in this book. Um, now, when I was a kid growing up, my dad used to tell me these stories about our family that he had heard from his dad, my grandfather, who died when I was 2 years old. And like Frederick, my grandfather was a photographer who came over from Germany in the 1920s. And he was quite a storyteller. He would spin these exciting tales about our family, stories about lost silver mines in Bavarian mountains and forbidden love with a beautiful Romani woman, and his time in 1930s Hollywood and turning down a job drawing Mickey Mouses with Walt Disney at the very beginning of Disney animation because he didn't want to draw Mickey Mouses. And one of his stories was about the time he crossed the United States on foot, and he ran out of money and was wandering around on the plains of Texas at night, I guess. I don't know. And he was starving and hadn't eaten for several days. So he stumbled upon these cowboys who were sitting around a campfire like my grandfather had seen in the movies. And he loved cowboy movies, I guess. And they had a chuck wagon full of steak and were eating dinner. So my grandfather, in this desperate state, asked if he could have some of their food. And apparently one of the cowboys sized him up and said, "Sure, go ahead, go ask Cookie to cut you off a steak." So my grandfather went up to the chuck wagon, and the cook cut him this enormous steak and fried it up on a cast iron skillet right in front of him. And the description of this steak that my grandfather ate with these cowboys is so vivid that even though I never heard the story firsthand from my grandfather, I don't remember him. I was 2 when he passed away. I can somehow picture it and how fresh and succulent and satisfying it tasted to him as someone who was poor and hungry and who didn't grow up with a lot of access to meat. So here's this image of this steak that's going across generations because my grandfather is such a good storyteller. But after he died, my dad learned that a lot of his stories weren't true. And it left this legacy of confusion about my family, which is that we don't quite know what is true and what is not true about who we are. We don't know, for example, whether that side of the family is from Austria or Germany, because there are reasons to think both based on things that my grandfather said. So we don't even know where we come from because of all this storytelling. And it made me think about how family identity affects personal identity. Families can have their own narratives and myths within them. If the stories that we're told about our families aren't true, then our self identity can be based on a foundation that is a lie. And a lot of the relationship between Vira, Mabel, and Sandra in my book are about what that looks like. So, what do you do when you have a legacy of family myths and storytelling? Well, if you're me, you're going to weave all those stories together in a big fictional novel. And part of the reason that this is such a dramatic book is because I was retelling some of my grandfather's stories. But I was also telling a bigger story about America and about California, a place that is always reinventing itself and ignoring the past, just like my grandfather did. So California, as we all know, is a state with a history of boom and bust, and that structure is mirrored in my book. There are lots of different gold rushes going on in this story beyond the literal gold rush of 1849. There's the farm boom of the early 20th century, the pursuit of Hollywood stardom, the shipbuilding boom of World War II Richmond, and so forth. And most of the characters in this book are gold rushing in one way or another. And while the gold rush is an iconic part of history, I think we tend to underestimate the importance it had in developing American culture as we understand it today. Um, there's a certain kind of ambition that entered into American consciousness during the gold rush, which is the idea that within one lifetime you can become fabulously wealthy or famous or successful if you work hard enough. And this is an idea that's very much alive today. You know, it's something people carry around with them, the belief that they too can become Elon Musk or Oprah or whatever it is if they have a good vision and work hard. And a lot of self-help industry is based on it, and it's part of the idea behind the American dream. Of course, access to the American dream isn't the same for everyone. You know, Black people, people of color, women have been kept from pursuing opportunities and held back. Sandra, you know, when she's attempting to pursue success, has to repeatedly confront the fact that a lot of people, that a lot of the things that she wants to do as an ambitious person aren't open to her as a woman. So when she finds herself desperately poor during the Great Depression, she looks at her options for employment and sees things that she doesn't want to do, like being a secretary or a waiter. Not that there's anything wrong with those jobs. I have been both of those things. But Sandra wants more, and she's a little bit of a snob, and she's aware that she's limited by her gender. And of course, her solution is to become a movie star, which isn't very realistic. Um, and she's also becomes more focused on marriage to a rich man because that is a way she can have power. Aren't a lot of ways for her to gain financial capital. Later, when she goes to a bank and tries to get a loan to start a business, she discovers that they won't lend to women. She's told, "We'll only sign a woman if a male relative will co-sign with you. You know, do you have a brother or a father who could do that for you?" And Vira and Mabel also face limitations because they're women. Vera doesn't want to leave her home in Maine and go to the gold rush with her husband, Elmer. The idea of going to the gold rush scares her. And she thinks, quote, they were leaving friends and family for the uneven gamble of striking it rich. What if it didn't work out? What if California was a terrible place? Or, Vera thought, slipping the tips of her fingers to her neck, what if Elmer died and left her alone in the wilderness? But Vera doesn't have a choice. She has to go because her husband is going and he makes the decisions. And as for Mabel, she faces the reality of what happens to women in the 19th century, of the 19th century, when they lose their status and are left to drift on their own. At the same time, though, these are white women who have a great deal of entitlement and privilege. And I don't let my characters off the hook with that. They do bad things, and there is a lot of questionable behavior in this book. These characters are not always likable. They're complex, like real people. And I didn't want to just write a book about how hard it was for women in the past, because we all know about that, right? I was interested in the ugly side of ambition and how following it to the exclusion to all else can lead down some dark paths, to moral compromises or destruction of relationships, for example. And at heart, this is a book about what happens when you fail at your goals? What happens if you are a person who shows up late for the gold rush? What happens if you are a person who wants to be a movie star and yet only gets a few bit parts? What does that do to you? What kind of self-destructive behavior comes from that? Um, and again, there's this personal side to it because I was very much thinking about my own ambition when I was writing this book. So I started this novel in 2005 and I worked on it for about 8 years. And, as most of you know, I'm sure, writing a novel requires a fair amount of toil and sacrifice. And the whole time I was writing this book, I was questioning my ambition, this internal drive that was leading me to finish this book, but was also causing me a fair amount of discontent. And so I was interrogating the idea of ambition. Like, when is it useful? When does it become empty? And I was also exploring some of my fears, frankly, about what I was doing. I was asking myself, like, what if I spent all my time writing this book and it fails? It doesn't get published. It never finds readers. And that brings me to the publishing story of right back where we started from. So I finished the book in 2012. And I started looking around for a literary agent, which is the first step when you're trying to get a book published. And I got an agent pretty quickly, and she started sending the book out in the fall of 2012 to publishers. And at first it went well. I was getting rejections from publishers, but they were what's called positive rejections with lots of good comments. Editors said that they thought the book was well written and it was interesting and exciting and natural book club fodder and so forth. So it seemed like it was on a positive trajectory. And I was cautiously optimistic that someone would publish the novel. Then two things happened that changed the situation. In the first iteration of my book, Sandra had a different name. She was called Sandy. And in November 2012, Hurricane Sandy happened, a devastating natural disaster that particularly affected New York, flooding the streets and subway lines and causing billions of dollars in damage. And just when we were starting to recover from that, on December 14th, Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting happened, a horrible mass murder that led to 28 people dying, many of them children. So, two horrific national tragedies that coincidentally had the same name as my character, Sandy. Now, I don't want to downplay the tragedy of these events at all. Obviously, the fate of my novel is trivial compared to what happened. But there was an unfortunate side effect in that it did affect my book. Editors, they're human, and publishing is pretty emotional, really. And here I was coming along with this complicated female character who does some bad things and who also happened to have the same name as these recent tragedies. And it didn't go over very well. Comments on the novel went from this is a good book that will probably be published to this book is so dark it's nihilistic, which is not true. It's not that dark. It is not nihilistic. So I think my book would have recovered, except then a third bad thing happened. My agent quit the publishing industry. She emailed to say she was going back to grad school and left my book stranded mid-submission in email boxes all over New York. And since the agency didn't take me on or help me out, that was kind of that. So naturally, I was very upset about the whole thing. I'd spent eight years on the novel, and it had failed. And that was interesting for a book about ambition and failure. But it's also not unusual. Getting a book published is hard. And I knew that. Most writers have sob stories a lot like mine. So I moved on. 6 years passed. I wrote 2 other books. I started winning awards and breaking into national publications as a journalist. So things were going pretty well. And then one day in 2018, right when I was gearing up to find another agent, a woman named Susan Velasquez from Jabberwocky Literary Agency emailed me. And she wanted to know if Right Back Where We Started From was still available. And I was surprised. I hadn't done anything with the novel for years. So I asked how she even knew about it. And it turned out that back in 2012, Susan was an intern at a literary agency where I submitted the novel and recommended the agent take me on as a client. And when that person passed, she kept my query letter, which is a letter that you send describing the book to people, with the intention to seek me out when she was ready to start her own client list and see if she could represent me. So that's what she did. And I ended up signing with Susan. And it was a great decision because she sold the book to Blackstone Publishing. And so here we are. My book is now out in the world and available at bookstores like Copperfields. So I'm thrilled about that. And I'm delighted to be here tonight for many reasons. And I thought before we moved on to any questions that I would read a short chapter from right back where we started from. It involves lightning and love at first sight. Um, this is not a chapter from Sandra's point of view. It's about her grandmother, Vira, and it's the farthest chronological chapter in the novel, set in 1850. Um, it's the beginning of how she ends up going to the California gold rush. So it's the beginning of everything that happens in the story. So here we go, chapter 3 of right back where we started from. It's a recorded fact that the Sanborn ball was held during a thunderstorm. While the bad weather might have been enough to cancel an ordinary party, this ball was much anticipated by Maine society because the venerable judge, Luke Sanborn, was expected to announce the engagement of his son, James Sanborn, to a Miss Melissa Fletcher. On top of that, the judge had converted the attic of his 3-story home into a ballroom. When the guests arrived, they were directed up 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd story, where the new ballroom spanned the length of the house. The maple floors gleamed, bouquets of flowers hung on the wall, and refreshments were laid out beside a barrel of Judge Sanborn's famous applejack. On one side of the room, a small orchestra was setting up. On the other, a balcony overlooked a field. Someone in reckless spirits had thrown open the door, and an energized breeze blew through the room. Every so often, lightning struck the field outside, and each time the guests exclaimed, "Ooh!" Only Elmer Sanborn, James's cousin, remained unmoved. He had more important things to think about than lightning. In less than a month, he was planning to leave for the California gold rush. His family was against the plan and insisted he come to the ball, hoping that a young lady would distract him from his goals. But they could never understand how dull the twirling dancers seemed to Elmer. Compared to the sparkling promise of California gold, Maine society women were as ordinary as wrens before his eyes. As everyone danced, Elmer stood by the wall with his hands behind his back, measuring the cost of the journey against the riches he expected to make in California. The newspaper said that a man could net over $1,500 a day in the gold rush. That was more than Elmer could expect as a yearly salary after a lifetime of working at his father's bank. And that was just one figure. It was possible to make 10 times that if you were lucky. Men were said to be able to stroll down the American River and scoop gold out of the water. Given this, Elmer couldn't understand why every man at this ball wasn't leaving for California this instant. Take his cousin James, whose engagement to Melissa Fletcher this ball was celebrating. Everyone said James was going to be a great lawyer like his father, but Elmer could only pity him. James would spend every day rearranging papers in an office, while Elmer would be living a life of wealth and adventure. Elmer had asked his cousin to come with him to California, but James had proposed to Melissa instead. To do something like that when there was a gold rush going on, Elmer couldn't fathom it. Near the balcony, James was standing beside Melissa, who was patting the bottom of her ringlets so they bounced upwards. Elmer had seen her do this several times, and each time the gesture had struck him as particularly vain. Now Melissa was talking to someone else, a woman. Who was that? Elmer could only see the side of her head. He strained forward, squinting through the dancers that separated him from the balcony until he recognized the girl. It was the piano player from church. Her name was Vira Webb. Here, Elmer tried to go back to thinking about the gold rush, but he kept trailing off to watch Vera instead. There was something arresting about her. It wasn't that she was prettier than the other girls here. Elmer wouldn't even have noticed her if she didn't get up in front of the congregation to play hymns every Sunday. No, something else was drawing Elmer's attention to Vera as she stood on the balcony with the evening sky streaked purple and gray behind her. He blinked to clear his vision. Yes, it was still there. Vera was glowing blue. It wasn't so much that Vera herself was blue as that the blue was hovering over her skin, encircling her face and neck, and fading into her clothes. It was a soft blue, the color of forget me nots, but noticeable enough that Elmer could see it from across the room. The feet of the dancers pounded to the rhythm of the Virginian reel as another gust of wind blasted the women's skirts. As if hypnotized, Elmer pushed through the dance floor to get closer to Vera. The blue outlined her body in a fuzzy radiance, like halos Elmer had seen in pictures of saints. She even looked a bit like a saint just then, smiling at Melissa with her hands clasped in front of her. Then, as Elmer watched, one of Vera's blonde curls rose off her forehead and stood straight in the air as if someone was holding it there. She was laughing, and the curl moved with her as she leaned forward and touched Melissa's arm with her icy blue hand. If nothing else, Elmer was a man of action. He dove across the room and tackled Vera, pulling her into the ballroom. The dancers stopped in collective shock, but there was no time for outrage. As soon as Vera's shoes cleared the balcony, there was a violent crack, like monstrous billiard balls slamming together. Lightning struck where Vera had been standing, hitting the balcony in a fierce stab as red and hot as a fireplace poker. Flames began to creep toward the ballroom. Before anyone could stop him, Jane Sanborn grabbed the barrel of Applejack and emptied it onto the fire. It was the wrong thing to do. Smoke billowed everywhere as the flames reacted to the liquor. People began to scream. Everyone to the stables, Luke Sanborn shouted. The guests rushed towards the stairs. Though the doorframe was wide enough for a man and woman to enter the ballroom in grand style, it wasn't wide enough for the minister's wife and two portly widows to shove through at once. For a moment, the women were caught like caterpillars in the beak of a bird, but then they burst into the hallway, their petticoats flying up in all directions. While this was going on, Vera lay in Elmer's grasp, apparently having fainted. Undaunted and rather enjoying himself, Elmer picked Vera up and carried her through the stampeding guests to the stables, where she regained consciousness in time to be laid in a carriage. For a moment, she met Elmer's hazel eyes with her own. Then he galloped off to help with the fire. That's a very brave young man, said a friend, watching Vera closely. Yes, Vera said. She might have said something else then, but as the word left her mouth, rain began to pour down in a torrent. The balcony was doused, and smoke rose to the sky. People hurried to their carriages, ball gowns slick like wet rose petals. The air was filled with the smell of burnt apples. As the women gathered around Vera, her blue eyes followed the men rushing to keep the weakening fire from spreading. Onlookers noted how she watched one man in particular as he darted through the rain. Some later said she caused the fire by standing where lightning could hit her. Thank you. That's it. Yeah. um, so I guess we're gonna do Q&A now. Yeah, Jamie.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that was fantastic and wanted to remind you where the Q&A was, as well as there was some lots of comments in the chat actually. So I'll let you do the Q&A and then I'll pop back up and read you some and we can go from there.
Okay. Yeah.
Don't forget to submit your questions and comments because we do have time, everyone on the call.
Yeah, please submit some questions. So I have an anonymous attendee said, how do you think the gold rush changed what ambition means to us as Americans? So that's a really good question. So before the gold rush, we had manifest destiny, the sort of idea of preordained prosperity and ownership over the land, which is, of course, extremely problematic concept. But the idea of ambition was slower, essentially. That Americans would come here to America and they would get some land or something, and slowly over generations they would accumulate wealth. And so when the gold rush came along, the that changed, and that became within one lifetime you can become fabulously wealthy or rich. And so yeah, so that was sort of how that changed. Is it became the way we think about ambition today, which is, you know, find your goal and your dream in life, and then you'll, you know, be able to you'll be able to have it. And you know, that's got some problems, doesn't it? I don't know. Yeah, so anybody else, any other questions?
Well, I have quite a few, as well as there were some questions that were comments that I just wanted to let you know. Jenny says, this is fascinating, Joy. Thank you so much for sharing so much about your process and your thought process. Tim says it sounds like an exciting book. Love the backstory, and it's not limited to her grandparents. So lots of really positive feedback. And I really loved hearing how it ties into your family's history. And I just think that's, you know, in addition to all the actual research you did on the history of it, the history of your own family is something that's really intriguing. And I'm wondering, you know, you talked a little bit about how your family history affects who you are, and learning about, you know, maybe stories in your past that weren't true. Did that affect you writing this book at all personally?
So in what sense? So did how did that reflect like how I view myself? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just interested in if there was a shift in the research you did personally as well.
Yeah. So I think like when my dad found out that his dad was telling whoppers, I love that word. Um, that was really shocking for him, because he believed his dad, you know, even though some of the stories were very dramatic. You know, it's your dad, you believe your parents, you know. And my dad made a big deal about how he would never lie to me. So he didn't tell me about Santa Claus. He didn't tell me like nothing. Like he's always been just as straight shooting as possible. And I think that because of that, I have this like delineation in the land where it's in the family where it's like my dad attempting to be as honest as possible, with me, and then everything that came before. So for me, I've it's always been really clear the difference. Does that make sense? So because of that, it's really interesting to compare sort of how I grew up with this very honest father, uh, radical honesty, I think they call it. My dad doesn't pay attention to that, but it's sort of that kind of thing, versus how he grew up and how it was a reaction to this because he didn't want to pass that on, because it's hurtful, you know, to have your parent lie to you, even if it's kind of an exciting, great kind of storytelling kind of way. So yeah, for me, that's part of it. But then also, I've always been curious if you know, that's why I'm such a storyteller. Like if there's a genetic component to
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I love how that story transcends. I mean, it goes from the characters into your life, and it actually had me thinking about my family while you were talking. So I really appreciated that. Oh, and look, we've got many questions and comments. A listener says a lot of times people believe their own lies and the myths they've made up about themselves and incorporate it into the personal story. Is that the case with your characters? I think you kind of touched on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Ethel's wondering, how did you navigate how much historical research and family facts to include in the novel? I can see how all that information would enrich the story, but did you find it also limiting to have to stick to reality while creating fiction? It's a good question.
Well, that is a good question. I do, you know, it's like I was saying, you know, there is a lot of like magical realism kind of elements to this where I did take liberties with facts because it's fiction. And you know, I am a journalist and I write about history a lot, and it was fun to just sort of use history as like creative fodder and sort of exaggerate when I wanted to. So that, you know, there is sort of, I was playing around with myth a lot and sort of making things a little exaggerated, a little heightened a lot. And it's kind of hard to explain exactly how I drew the line, because I feel like if I get the general gist of, like, for example, with central casting, I do put a lot of facts about how central casting worked, but then I also created this whole scenario for it that didn't exist, which was I set it in an abandoned department store, and I have it so that all the people who are looking for a role stand outside of this display window, and they come and stand inside, and all the people vie for a role outside this display window in this empty department store. So that's all made up. Like, I completely made that up. So I really was playing around with reality and fiction in this story, and same with family stories, putting things that happened or may have happened, and sort of just playing around with the themes and trying to get at like a deeper truth about about people and about sort of American life a little bit. So.
I think that was a incredibly clever way to do it. In addition to putting that new spin on it, like we've all kind of read a little bit, but it just kind of takes you into that character. So I didn't get a chance to read this before, but I'm really looking forward to reading it now.
Good.
We do have a couple more questions about your research, and Rod's wondering, he says, my brother lives in Placerville. I guess, what was it called? Hangville?
Hangtown. Yeah.
Hangtown.
And Dry Diggins. It had a couple of names. Yeah.
He says he was wondering, how much history did you include about the town in the gold rush era?
Well, that's just a very short chapter. I do have the Elmer and Vera living in the hotel that was there. And I have Elmer, he's panning for gold, and he runs into this hostile mining corporation that's formed that are basically vigilantes. So it isn't a lot about, Placerville and the exact history of Placerville, but there is a scene, and this, I've described the town as rough, and I use descriptions of the town, and there's nobody gets hanged or anything, but there's a horse auction going on. So
I'm excited. I grew up in a small town called Murphy's, which
Oh,
if
yeah.
you studied Columbia and all of those places.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to hear about that part of the story, to read through that. I do kind of want to take a second here, because the story about getting your book published is a story in its own. I mean, the Sandy, I can't help but I laughed a little bit just of the randomness of it all. And I just appreciate your perseverance to continue. And I'm wondering, what advice do you have for those people out there in the same position as you, or maybe who want to start writing a book but don't know where to start?
Well, it's funny. So today I actually published an essay where I talked about that a little bit in LitHub, and I told the story in the essay as well. And it's funny because I really think the only lesson I can really take away from it is you don't have any control over publishing, so you might as well just write the story you want to write, because in the end, like, you can get waylaid by bad luck like I did, or just not, just it doesn't hit for whatever reason, and you just have to keep going as a writer and keep trying to get better and focus on your craft and practice, and I think over time, if you do good work, it really does get noticed after a while. That's my experience. I do think cream rises to the top, so it's not very exciting advice, but it's basically, just keep writing and do the things that are important to you as an artist and as a writer, and hopefully eventually someone will notice you toiling in obscurity.
Yeah, and I have respect that you continue to develop your skill set. I mean, I know I haven't included your website yet, but I will. And I know you have a blog, and you said you've been writing articles. So I'm sure that didn't deter people from wanting to get to know what more you can do in the literary world. And the last question I have is, okay, I have two questions. What is your next project? What can we expect from you?
Okay, that's a good question. I have a couple of projects. I have some articles coming out, and but I'm working on an essay collection that my agent is shopping around, and that's based on a lot of essays I've already written, a lot about literary history in California, actually. And then I'm also working on a new novel, which I am hoping to find time to get back to and finish up. Hopefully this year. I would love to finish it this year. That would be terrific for me. So that's my
That
goal.
would be so great because I would love to have you back in person
I would love that.
real soon.
Thank
Um, I want to thank you again. This has been just a great way to wind down the day. And thank you to everyone who joined, who asked questions. Just a reminder that there will be an email tomorrow that will include everything from here. It will have a link to the recording. It will include the discount code, as well as I'm going to try and get the link from you regarding your article, and I'll include that in there as well. But thank you so much again. And I'm wondering, Joy, would you mind taking us out for the evening?
you. And say good night.
Just saying good night,
Oh,
or
okay.
yeah, no, I'm sorry, that was confusing.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody, and I see a couple of people I know: Jenny Pritchett, Ethel, Marcia, Kyle, Ken. Thank you for
Oh,
coming on, and yeah, thank you again, Copperfields. This was terrific, and I feel like a real author now. So thank you.
you are. You are. Well, great. I can't wait to have you back, and we'll be in touch very soon. Thank you all.
All right. Bye, everybody.